All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of PlayStation 2 modding, specifically FreeHDBoot and FreeMCBoot, two pretty popular ways to unlock the potential of your PS2.
Yeah, they're often called soft mods because you don't have to, physically modify the hardware of the console itself.
Exactly. Plus, with these mods, you can play backups, run emulators, load games from USB drives, or even an internal hard drive.
Yep, pretty much opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
Right, like if you're looking to breathe some new life into your old PS2, or maybe you're just curious about how these mods actually work, we've got a ton of great resources for this deep dive too. Forum discussions, guides, and even a really helpful YouTube tutorial. So we're going to break down all the pros and cons, the nitty-gritty details, and figure out which method might be right for you.
Yeah, we'll try to cover everything from the basics to some more advanced tips and tricks.
Perfect. So first things first, what exactly are the differences between FreeHDBoot, or FHDB as we'll call it, and FreeMCBoot, which we'll shorten to FMCB?
Okay, so the core difference really lies in where they boot from. FMCB runs from a memory card, while FHDB runs directly from the hard drive.
Okay, I see. So with FHDB, you don't even need a memory card to run it.
Exactly. That frees up your memory card slots for game saves.
Nice. That's a huge plus, especially for anyone with a massive PS2 library.
Yeah, for sure.
But I'm guessing there's got to be a catch, right?
Well, you do need a compatible PS2 model to use FHDB, specifically the fat PS2s, the ones with the expansion bay on the back.
Oh, right.
The slim models don't have that bay, so they can't use FHDB.
Gotcha. So that's something our listeners will definitely need to check before they get started.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about the hardware requirements for each method. Starting with FMCB, what do our listeners absolutely need to get started?
Well, first off, you'll need a memory card, obviously, and then you'll need a way to get the FMCB files onto that memory card.
Right?
There are a few different ways to do that. You can buy a preloaded memory card online.
Oh, okay, that sounds easy.
Yeah, it's definitely the most convenient option, but you can also use a device called an Action Replay. Or you can even burn a disk with the FMCB installer on it.
Okay, so there are options for different budgets and tech skills.
Exactly.
And what about FHDB?
So for FHDB, besides that compatible PS2 model we talked about, you'll need a network adapter for the PS2, an IDE hard drive.
IDE.
Yeah, IDE. Or you can use a SATA drive with an adapter, and then you'll need a way to connect that drive to your computer to actually set it up.
Okay, so it sounds like FHDB requires a bit more hardware compared to FMCB.
Yeah, it's fair to say.
And what about the installation process itself? Which one is generally considered easier?
FMCB is generally considered easier to install, especially if you go with that preloaded memory card option. It can be a really straightforward process.
Yeah, that makes sense. Less hardware, less setup. But I was browsing through some forums earlier, and I saw a few people mentioning some issues they ran into during the installation process. Like some users were having trouble with generic PS2 to SATA adapters, and some even ran into the dreaded black screen of doom.
Ah, yes, the black screen of doom. A
Yeah.
classic.
Not a good sign.
Not at all. But the good news is that the YouTube tutorial we mentioned earlier actually covers some workarounds for those kinds of issues.
Oh, perfect. So there are solutions out there.
Yeah, the PS2 modding community is super helpful.
Yeah, I've noticed that. There are tons of resources and people willing to help out.
For sure.
Okay, so it seems like choosing between FMCB and FHDB really boils down to a few key factors. Ease of installation, hardware requirements, and maybe your own personal comfort level with a bit of tech tinkering.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's all about weighing the pros and cons and figuring out which method aligns best with your needs and your skill level.
Right, because FMCB definitely seems like the more accessible option for beginners.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's simpler to set up and requires less specialized hardware.
But you mentioned earlier that FHDB can be a bit more reliable. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So because FHDD boots directly from the hard drive, it bypasses a lot of the potential issues that can sometimes come up with memory cards.
Like what kind of issues?
Well, memory cards can be prone to corruption over time, and they can also wear out with heavy use.
Right, that makes sense. So with FHDB, you don't have to worry about those things.
Exactly.
But I think you also mentioned that FHDB can have slightly slower boot times.
Yeah, that's true. It's not a huge difference, maybe a few seconds longer compared to FMCB, but it's something to keep in mind.
Okay, so not a deal breaker, but worth noting.
Right.
Now, I was reading through a Reddit thread earlier,
Yeah.
and someone mentioned that their PS2 became really noisy after they installed the hard drive.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that before.
Any idea what might cause that?
Well, it could be the hard drive itself. Older hard drives can be a bit noisy, especially if they're spinning at high speeds. But it could also be the PS2's fan.
The fan.
Yeah, the fan might be working overtime to compensate for the extra heat generated by the hard drive.
Oh, that's interesting. So maybe using a solid-state drive and SSD could be a quieter solution.
Absolutely. SSDs are much quieter than traditional hard drives, and they're also much faster.
Oh, even better.
Yeah,
Faster loading times and a quieter gaming experience.
exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the differences between FMCB and FHDB, the hardware requirements, and even some potential issues that people might run into during the installation process. Now let's dive into the installation process itself. Are there any key steps or potential pitfalls that our listeners should be aware of?
Absolutely. So before you even start the installation process for either method, it's really important to check your DVD firmware version compatibility.
DVD firmware version.
Yeah. You need to make sure that your PS2's DVD drive has the right firmware version to support these mods.
Okay, and where can people find that information?
It's readily available online. Just do a quick search for PS2 DVD firmware version compatibility.
Gotcha.
And another thing to keep in mind is the file size limit for FAT32.
FAT32.
Yeah, that's the standard formatting for PS2 hard drives. And the limit is 4 GB per file.
4 GB.
Yep, so if you have any game ISOs that are larger than 4 GB, you'll need to split them into smaller files before you can transfer them to the hard drive.
Okay, so another potential hurdle for people to be aware of.
Right.
But I'm sure there are tools out there to help with that.
Of course. There's a program called WinHype that's really helpful for formatting the hard drive and making sure everything is set up correctly.
WinHype.
Yep,
Okay, we'll have to make a note of that.
good idea.
So once you've got all your games loaded onto the hard drive, what's the best way to manage them?
Well, there's a program called HDL Batch Installer that makes it really easy to transfer games to the hard drive.
HDL batch installer.
Yep. It's pretty much a drag and drop process.
Okay, so it's pretty user-friendly.
Yeah, very much so.
And for those of us who like things to look nice and organized, I heard there's a program that lets you add cover art to your games.
You're thinking of OPL Manager?
OPL Manager.
Yep, that's the one.
So you can make your game library look all fancy.
Exactly.
Makes it easier to find what you're looking for, too.
Definitely. Now, this might sound like a silly question, but
Yeah.
can you install FHDB without FMCB?
Not a silly question at
Yeah.
all. And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
You can actually install FHDB without ever using FMCB.
Oh, wow, really?
Yep. There's something called the FHDB Newbie Pack.
Newbie Pack.
Yeah, it's basically a pre-configured hard drive image that you download. Then you format your hard drive with that image. And then you can install it directly onto your PS2.
So no memory card needed?
Nope. No memory card, no FMCB.
That's amazing. It's like a shortcut to FHDB.
Yeah, it's a great option for people who are comfortable with basic drive formatting.
Right. It's really cool to see how dedicated the modding community is to making these processes more accessible.
Absolutely. There are always people working on new tools and techniques. Yeah, it's incredible how much passion and knowledge surrounds a console that's over 2 decades old.
Yeah, it really is. The PS2 has such a rich history and a massive library of games.
It's a classic for a reason.
For sure.
All right, so let's bring things back to the present. Let's say our listener is convinced they want to mod their PS2. What final tips and tricks would you offer to help them succeed?
Well, I think the most important tip is to do your research. Don't just jump into this blindly. There are tons of great resources online, detailed guides, active forums, where you can ask questions and get advice from experienced modders.
So don't be afraid to reach out for help if you need it.
Exactly. The PS2 modding community is really welcoming and supportive.
I've noticed that. And what else should our listeners keep in mind?
Patience is key. Modding can be a bit fiddly at times, so don't get discouraged if things don't work perfectly on the first try.
Right.
Just double check your steps, take your time, and don't be afraid to ask for help if you get stuck.
It's all part of the learning process. And I bet that feeling of accomplishment when you finally boot up your modded PS2 and see your game library on the screen,
Yeah.
it must be amazing.
Oh, it's totally worth it. It's like you're giving this classic console a whole new lease on life.
It's like you're breathing new life into it.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of breathing new life into things, did you know that you can actually upgrade the PS2's hardware?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like you can replace the original fan with a quieter one.
Yep, that's a popular upgrade. Especially for people who are bothered by the noise of the original fan.
I bet. That thing can sound like a jet engine sometimes.
It can.
So you can actually silence that beast.
You can.
That's incredible.
It is. And it makes for a much more enjoyable gaming experience.
For sure. Any other hardware upgrades worth considering?
Well, if you're going the hard drive route, I highly recommend getting a solid-state drive and SSD.
We talked about those earlier.
We did. They're much faster and quieter than traditional hard drives. And they're also more durable.
Right, so they're less likely to be affected by bumps and jostles.
Yes, exactly.
Plus, they're not as prone to failure as older hard drives.
True. They might be a bit pricier. But I think they're worth the investment for serious PS2 enthusiasts.
I agree. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the differences between FMCB and FHDB, the hardware requirements, installation tips, and even some hardware upgrades. What would you say is the most crucial takeaway for our listeners today?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing is to approach PS2 modding with a sense of curiosity and a willingness to learn.
I like that.
These mods are a gateway to a whole world of possibilities.
Right.
It's about taking control of your gaming experience and tailoring it to your preferences.
It's about making it your own.
Exactly.
And the PS2, with its open source nature and thriving community, it's the perfect platform for that kind of exploration.
Yeah, it really is.
We've been focusing on playing backups this whole time, but there's also a whole universe of PS2 homebrew out there.
Oh.
Emulators, utilities, even fan-made games. It's like this hidden layer of creativity and innovation that most people aren't even aware of.
It's a treasure trove of hidden gems.
And it's a great example of how passionate communities can breathe new life into older platforms, pushing their capabilities far beyond their original design.
Absolutely.
Imagine playing classic NES or SNES games on your PS2. Or using homebrew apps to organize your game library. Or customize your console's interface. The possibilities are endless.
They really are.
It's incredible.
It is. It speaks to the power of open source technology and the ingenuity of dedicated enthusiasts.
It really does.
Yeah.
Who knows, maybe exploring the world of PS2 homebrew could be our next deep dive.
Oh, I like that idea.
I think it would be fascinating.
It would be.
It's amazing how this conversation has taken us from the nuts and bolts of hard drive installations to the broader implications of open source gaming.
It has been quite a journey.
It has.
And it just highlights how technology, even in its retro forms, can continue to inspire creativity and exploration.
Well said. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the world of PS2 modding, what's the one key message you want to leave our listeners with?
I'd say don't be afraid to tinker, experiment, and push the boundaries of what you thought was possible. The journey is incredibly rewarding.
It's about embracing that DIY spirit that fueled so much innovation in the early days of gaming.
Exactly.
And who knows, you might even discover a hidden talent for tech wizardry along the way.
You never know what you might unlock, both in your console and in yourself.
That's a great way to put it. So to all those intrepid modders out there,
go forth and breathe new life into those classic PlayStations.
And if you stumble upon any amazing homebrew creations or a secret trick for silencing that PS2 fan, be sure to share your discoveries with the community.
Absolutely.
The joy of modding is best when it's shared.
For sure.
Happy modding, everyone.
Happy modding.
And until our next deep dive.
Keep those consoles humming and those controllers clicking.
Catch you next time.